Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone to our second OHBM Trainees online workshop. I'm Amelie, I'm the social media manager of the OHBM student and postdoc special interest group. And today I'm going to moderate this workshop together with Lily. She's our current secretary of our group. This workshop is meant to be interactive, but please try to have your microphone on mute when our speakers are talking. During the Q&A, of course, you can ask questions. You can either raise your virtual hand or write in the chat, and then we can moderate it or the speakers can answer those questions directly. And of course, feel free to unmute your microphone. We expect all attendees to follow the official OHBM code of conduct. I think all of you received it via email. Also, as you just figured out, this workshop will be recorded and shared on our social media for all the trainees who were not able to make it to today's session. So we will also take pictures during this workshop. If you don't feel okay with your face being seen, just turn off your video. And finally, we want to thank OHBM and the MNI for sponsoring this event. Today, we are going to talk about bridging academia and industry, and we will have two 20-minute talks, each followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. So please welcome our first speaker, Anna Khazenzon. Anna finished her PhD in cognitive neuroscience in 2019 at Stanford University. Now she works as a data scientist at Quizlet, where she builds online study tools. Thank you so much for being here, Anna.
Great. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Thanks so much, Amelie and Lily, for moderating this and that kind of introduction. I'm really excited to speak with you all today. HBM was always one of my favorite conferences during grad school, and it feels really nice to be welcomed back to share what I've been doing since then. So let's get started. Let me see. That should look a little better. All right, so I'm going to talk about transitioning from academia to industry. Oh, and I'm sharing my my Twitter handle in case you want to follow, but FYI, I'm pretty shy and more of a lurker, so you can see what I like if you follow, but just, you know, flagging that. All right, so today I'm going to be sharing knowledge with you as an expert on my own lived experience. Last week's workshop was from someone who's written a book on this whole topic of exploring the landscape of jobs outside of academia, and I'm going to have a little bit more of a narrative of how things worked for me with that kind of color that provides. So a little background, I started out getting interested in neuroscience through cognitive science. I was always a bit more of a generalist, liked a lot of things and wanted to be able to fuse them together in undergrad, and became more and more interested in the brain and implementation level questions, how it is that we're able to hold on to ephemeral experiences and create lasting memories out of them. And so I spent about 10 years doing academic research, but I'd say for about 5 of them, I knew that I didn't want to end up in academia. So I knew that pretty early on. And so I spent most of grad school kind of exploring and figuring out what I wanted to do next, and ended up landing on data science, which wasn't the most surprising pick for me. And now I've been working at Quizlet, which is an online learning company, and I've been there almost a year. It'll be a year in September. So that's a little bit of background on who I am. And a little tiny bit on what Quizlet is, in case you're curious. So we just create lots of different study tools, and some of them are more straightforward, flashcard based. Get to work on things like smarter grading of long form text. We also create fun things like games, like this matching game where you can kind of study anatomy terms. So roadmap for the talk today. I'm gonna talk about how I explored the idea of industry and tips that I might have for you, how you can think about getting ready to apply to jobs, and what adjusting to the new environment can be like. So exploring the idea. I'd say that whether to explore alternative careers while you're in grad school is a question not of if, but of when. I think everyone on the traditional academic track should consider what working in industry truly would be like, if only to gain conviction in the path that you're on. It's really easy for us to start on the academic track and feel like it's the only way, it's all you hear about, all of your peers seem to have this one-track mind with one concrete goal. So it's healthy to learn a little bit about the world outside of the ivory tower. And I think the ideal timing is probably a few years before defending. If you are doing a 5-year PhD, I think like year 3, maybe even year 2, you'd start doing some exploratory work. Okay, so why leave academia? Why consider transitioning to something else? A lot of people, I think, are motivated to get away from something that they don't like so much. There are a lot of flaws that can be generalized to academia, maybe a little bit more specific to the department, lab, or field that you're in. But no matter what it is that worries you about staying in academia or potentially about job prospects down the road, there's always a chance you'll encounter it in your next venture. So I'd like to reorient you to focus instead on what you're most drawn to and think through how that might actually change in different contexts. What are the contexts where that might really be heightened? Places where it might be possible, but not necessarily a given. And whittle down your kind of list of what to explore outside of academia based on those positives. And then start exploring the most promising options on that list. So I want to ask you all to actually pause and do a little bit of reflection before I get into the rest of the talk on what you value most about your academic life. And try to get a little bit more concrete than the typical, I like teaching, I like independent research, and take a few seconds to really think about what it is in your day-to-day or in a kind of long-term image of what an academic career could look like. What is it that you truly value, and share it in the chat. Cool, working with intelligent, curious people. Freedom, flexibility, the people, thinking critically, the communication aspects, learning, lots of learning, personal freedom to investigate what you're really interested in, growth, new facts, attending conferences, knowledge-based culture, freedom, learning, and the people, definitely. Yep, deriving insightful information from raw data. That's probably the one that resonates most with me. Coding, asking questions, designing experiments. Great. Having that kind of agentic control over what it is that you're working on rather than being handed a list. Clinical impact. I love that. What kinds of impact you can have. Okay, great. I'll move on. So a lot of these resonated with me. I don't know if you saw some that resonated with you that you hadn't thought about yet. And I think a lot of my concerns early on were that I would lose some of those valuable aspects. I think I heard a lot from folks who'd gone on about kind of differences in the makeup of their colleagues after leaving academia, definitely limitations in their kind of academic freedom, even though they had prior experience in a particular domain. Their opinion wasn't really valued at a company because that's not what they were hired for. So I think a lot of these are very valid things to value a lot about academia and to think critically about as you consider next steps. But I'll end on, I will say as a positive, I think most of these you would be able to find an environment where you can thrive and still have these elements elsewhere. They're not unique to academia per se, they're just really strongly associated with it. Okay, so with this kind of set of concrete elements that you really value in your academic life, the first thing I'd suggest you do is go seek out stories, as many stories as you can for people like me, but maybe more one-on-one stories as well. Start out with colleagues, with folks in your network who've done work, held positions that you might be interested in, or even ones that you know nothing about. I think there's still so many job titles I could not tell you what they are. And I probably could have done due diligence and explored what they are during grad school and figured out even more opportunities that might have been good fits for me. Attend industry tech talks. You'll probably hear this advice in lots of places, but I really can't highlight it enough. It was so useful for me, particularly early on in my PhD, in order to figure out what I don't like about industry and what worries me. A lot of industry tech talks were at larger companies, and there were elements that really worried me. I think I kind of feel like it's like this assembly line approach that you kind of see at larger companies, where you have a really specialized task that you do, and maybe you are just handed a list and have a lot less control over what your day-to-day is. So understanding that fit can really come from attending industry tech talks. And then seek out blog posts, research papers. You don't have to sit through talks to learn these things. I found great technical blog posts at Quizlet before attending, which gave me a lot of hope that this would be an environment that'd be really intellectually stimulating for me, where I'd learn a lot. And other companies might actually have great posts that describe their entire, data science structure, if that's something you're interested in looking into. So you can learn a lot about how everything is organized, how large and respected the data science branch of the company is, quickly online. Something I've already alluded to, one of the factors to consider is company size. I think it's a trade-off that's somewhat similar to choosing a newer, maybe younger versus more tenured and established faculty advisor. Data science is much more full stack, kind of more PhD-like at smaller companies, and you get to have a much higher impact there than you would at a larger company. However, on the flip side, at larger companies, you can probably focus on a specialty. If you know really concretely, you like that science communication aspect, you don't love the data wrangling, you definitely don't like programming, you can probably get a niche role where you spend your day-to-day doing exactly what you love. So it's a very Goldilocks phenomenon. You want to find the company at the size that feels right for you, and the company will grow if you start out at a smaller one, most likely. So you might need to transition more often if you seek out that really exciting environment where you have a lot of ownership and impact. Okay, so you've done some exploring, figured out what the right maybe company stage is for you, whether you want to work at a company or not, want to consider something more like a nonprofit, and how do you actually go about applying? So the first thing I'd recommend is find a very local community. Are there other trainees in your lab considering non-academic opportunities? Can you kind of find others in your department? Try to set up regular meetings. I remember as like an earlier grad student, earlier in my time as a grad student, seeing clandestine, like closed door meetings of people whispering about considering other opportunities, and really being that support system for each other. No matter what you read online, it doesn't feel concrete until you're hearing from people who you know well, their, all the ins and outs of their journey transitioning. So I really encourage that. And meetups, of course, are a great way to go too. So it's great that you're already in this SIG, talking to others who are potentially interested in this transition. Please keep in touch with everyone. And I found groups specifically for women in tech really useful and supportive during grad school, like Women in Machine Learning and Data Science. Our Ladies group is phenomenal, so I couldn't recommend these any more highly. Okay, so find that support system and then start your concrete search. So something that I've found and can't highlight enough to everyone who's nervous about making this career transition, job descriptions are very much TBD. So don't feel like you're locked into a particular job description the moment you see it. It'll kind of be defined as the role evolves within a company or within an organization. It's not very easy for a company to predict its exact needs at the moment they're posting a job description. And companies reorganize a lot, and you can change roles internally. So don't feel like you're wedded to the exact line items, roles listed, and requirements listed associated with those roles. For instance, a company may have just raised a round of funding and decided, hey, we've got some more money. We can actually look at the data we've been collecting with our product. And they might not even know what those data needs are. So don't feel intimidated by the exact line items on a job description. And also, encouragingly, this is very relevant for me, they might not know that someone with your exact skill set exists. I think a lot of the successes that I had in my job search involved people being weirdly like interested in someone with a bit of a psychology background, maybe even specifically in the fact that I researched memory, and nothing in their job description would have indicated that. Sometimes the mission of the company was related, like it was at Quizlet, but sometimes it had nothing to do with my background. They just liked the idea that I've studied humans, I've carefully designed experiments that involve measuring complex human behavior. So again, don't be afraid to apply, regardless of what a job description is listing. Same with job titles, not a big deal. I guess I ended up in a role that aligned pretty well with the job description or with the job title that I wanted, but that's not really how I set about applying. I was just selecting roles that sound roughly aligned with what I'd like to be doing at a place where I was sure that I wanted to be. So I kind of focused a little bit more on the context, the environment, than I did on the specifics of the job title. So just to give you an example, other than data scientist, I considered lots of other job titles: quantitative and mixed methods user researchers, people scientist, what is that? Data analyst, you'll see a lot of positions for those. I even tried for things like a learning sciences lead or a psychometrician, and various researcher roles that have been kind of instantiated in different organizations. So I think I even applied to something related to the FBI. Like it was cast a wide net, and really focused on the places as opposed to the specifics of the job title. And I actually dug up the job description that I applied for and ultimately ended up working towards, and looked back, and I certainly didn't meet a lot of the required and preferred qualifications. Some of them were like questionable. Definitely didn't have 5+ years of experience in data science. I went straight from grad school. Didn't have like quantitative model wins to list. No experience with productionizing machine learning services. It's more of an R person than a Python person. No NLP background. No experience with this technology. But I had this learning science background and enough of a data science background that they were excited to see my resume. Okay, this is the most practical, so I'll go quickly. When you're applying, it's okay to upskill. You don't have to have all the skills that are listed right away. You can get those skills and then apply. So there are some core skills that are definitely expected, and you should work on those. So picking up SQL is like the most expected thing that I'd have for you to do before you apply for more technical jobs. Everyone's going to have some SQL questions. And just do a quick tutorial, and you'll probably get good enough to pass some of those interviews. Refresh on data structures and algorithms, and practice, practice, practice in the communities that you form to support you. Start meeting weekly and just find that time to get that interview prep. And also probably get fluent in Python. I was much more of an R, maybe even MATLAB person, but really just pick one language, get totally fluent in it so that you have no anxiety on interview day based on the specific syntax that you're trying to wrangle data with, if that's the route you go. Quick note on resumes. You can Google tons of tips. People have way too many opinions on resumes. Don't be overwhelmed by them. But it does matter to kind of think about the cognitive biases people have, attentional limits, the fact that they might be seeing over 1,000 resumes for a single position. So really make the core piece of information that you want to share, make it really pop. Remember to take the perspective of a hiring manager. What information do they need? This isn't your biography, your brag sheet. It's really just a way to give them the exact information they need. Feel free to tailor it to the position that you're applying to. Doesn't have to be the same resume that you send out everywhere. And in addition to practicing technical questions, no matter where you're interviewing, practice behavioral ones as well. You can find lists of common interview questions online. I'd suggest preparing a table with some anecdotes from your experience that you arrange with the STAR method. You can find, again, lots of resources on that. Common method just for articulating exactly what problems you're solving and what impact you have. It's going to be really important. Another controversial point is networking. You may have heard that networking is everything and that you really get jobs through your network. And that's true to an extent. Referrals matter a lot in industry, and they're weighted very heavily. I almost didn't get the position I have now because there was another candidate who did have an internal referral. And I'd say that I had more surface level success through networking. Plus I got insider scoop, like I have to apply quarters in advance of a start date in order to be considered for a job at some companies. So that was really useful. But I'd say I had more true success. So like positive experiences that companies that actually want to join with the companies that I just applied to online through a job board. So also, you know, take the advice about networking and needing referrals with a grain of salt. They're not the be all end all by any means. Okay, last little section, I'll try to go quickly so we have time for questions. On adjusting to the new environment. So I've talked a little bit about my process during the PhD, preparing, how I went about applying. What's it been like since? I had this quote from Julia Silge up on a post-it in my office during grad school, because when I found it, it just resonated so much. During like an R studio interview, she said, I'm missing the idea of what I wish academia was. And that helped me get through like that last year of grad school. And I still think back on it right now when I think, oh, do I miss, you know, what I had in academia, or do I just miss this like idealistic vision of what I really wanted from academia? And I still kind of reflect on it today. So there's so much that I love about my job. I love the direct impact, and I love that it's at scale. Like there are easily millions of people who are impacted by the work I do every day. I personally feel like I have a lot more room for research creativity and independence and freedom. As a researcher in this role on a small team that works a little bit more quickly than I did in the particular lab I was in for grad school. So that's actually something that I felt like was a net gain outside of academia. Really been enjoying cross-functional teamwork. That's something I didn't think about at all before transitioning. In academia, everyone has the kind of the same skill set as you, like different domain expertise, but you're all kind of full stack researchers. And you get to work with so many different types of people with different drives and motivations outside of academia. So I really appreciate that. And I'm absolutely continually learning. That's something I loved in academia and something that I'm loving in industry in the tech world as well. This was the biggest shock. People openly come to work and talk about non-work activities. Every Monday when I came to work, I was just like floored by the fact that people shared what they did on the weekend. And it was usually something fun, not like working on writing a paper. So that always gets me. It took me a while to get used to that. I'm kind of gonna gloss through this, but cross-functional teamwork is really rewarding, but really hard. And something to work on a lot as you transition. Product sense is something that I was nervous about. How do I go about thinking about a tech product, building it, testing it? But I took it really seriously and that paid off. And if there are aspects that are lacking in the industry environment, you're always free to create the culture that you want. I wanted to learn more and benefit more from these colleagues with very different skill sets. Now my team pairs every other week to transfer skills and share knowledge. I wanted to discuss more literature. I missed journal clubs. I missed symposia. So now we do that. We have journal clubs. We have book discussions. And I also wanted to collaborate more with academics, and that was very feasible. We now help organize a conference that bridges academia and industry for my specific domain area, which is online learning. We're actually hosting an event soon. It's free if you want to join, but search for BAYLAN, Bay Area Learning Analytics Network, if you want to come and check out some data on online learning and how it's been affected by COVID. And that's it. I think I went a couple minutes over. So I want to open up to questions right away, but also feel free to ask me questions after this session if you have any more. I have my Twitter handle. If you want to email me, it's just that, my full name @gmail.com. I think someone's already found me on LinkedIn. Feel free to find me on LinkedIn and message me there. Pretty easy to find with my name. All right, opening it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. So if anyone has questions, you can either write it in the chat or just unmute your microphone and ask it directly.
Oh, how long did it take me to find a job? That's a great question. It took longer than I expected. So I encourage you to start looking years before you graduate, and I'd encourage you to start applying probably close to a year before you're ready to start a position. Because yeah, as I said, some positions actually fill multiple quarters before the potential start date, and budgeting happens well in advance at certain companies. So like my role actually didn't even have budget to get started until the time that I wanted to start, which was months after I'd been applying. So that worked out perfectly. So definitely multiple months. How easy do you think it would be to get back into academia if you wanted to? I don't have a sense of how easy it would be. I hope it'd be relatively easy, because I always toy with the idea of like just going back and doing a postdoc, because I do still really love research, and I'm more of like an explorer. So I knew I wanted to explore working in a different context. That doesn't mean that I'm married to it. I mean, I don't think, I have a sense that it's not that hard to get into a postdoc, and that outside experience is valued. I don't think it's as hard as it could seem, but I don't have a very concrete answer. In terms of scientific rigor, how does industry compare with academia, or is it really down to the individuals you work with? Oh, great question. Definitely depends where you're working and who you're working with, much like it does lab to lab or field to field in academia. Some of my colleagues also came from academia and were quite rigorous scientists. So I feel like if anything, the bar has been elevated. But again, that's going to be variable. You really have to interview your teammates when you're interviewing. I've seen some positions open now, but I don't graduate until May. I'm not sure I should apply now since I won't be able to start until next year. Great. I would contact the hiring managers, the company, and ask, or just apply anyways. Worst case, you find out if they even saw and were interested in your resume. You don't actually have to interview, but you can at least find out from them whether it makes sense to, right? Okay. Do you think having a PhD is advantageous when you're applying for industry jobs? I'd say it's a double-edged sword. There are stereotypes associated with having a PhD, and my manager actually told me she was really hesitant to hire me because of the PhD, because she's had bad experiences working with them in the past. They weren't from neuroscience or psychology, and so I think she's updated her model. But there's stereotypes that you don't really care about the product or the communication side of things. You just care about research and technical advancement or technical problems. So it might not be advantageous if you fall in that camp, unless you're shooting for a larger company that has an established research wing, in which case that's necessary. It's necessary to have that PhD. Okay, I realize I have a lot of transferable skills. How does one make that apparent through resumes? How do I convey that? Stories. So as you set up your anecdotes for behavioral interviews, you can really highlight those skills, and that'll be fantastic. But you can also visually highlight those transferable skills. So in the example resume that I had on the slide, there was just a skills section, the little bar that indicated how proficient you are in those skills. Really make them pop. Make the ones that you like the most pop too, to make sure that it's well aligned with the job that you're applying for. Do I think a postdoc is a good idea to upskill? You can probably upskill on your own and apply to jobs faster. I haven't seen that having a postdoc has any differential positive signal for employers. They don't really know how it's different from grad school, and makes them feel like it could send the signal that like you don't actually know that you want to transition to industry. So not necessarily. I think just go ahead and try to gain the skills that you think are necessary. Look at job postings, see what skills are required, and work on those. I don't think you have to do a postdoc by any means. Did I consider not working with data? Not too seriously, but kind of. And now probably half my time is spent not working with data. I'm doing a lot of learning science, like research and lit reviews and communication. But I love data at heart, so that's tough. Okay, let's see how much does your academic profile matter? Not at all, I'd say. Did you apply to a company that you wanted to work at without a related job posting? Not really. You can try, but I don't know how successful that approach would be. Is there less of a stigma towards those of the masters versus those of the PhD? Depends what the master's in, but I'd say probably. I think a lot of people do have some technical masters, and that is looked upon favorably. Okay, got through everything. Lightning round of questions. If you have more, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your talk and answering all the questions. Maybe you can put your email in the chat or your Twitter handle so people know.
Great idea.
To contact. And
thanks, everyone.
Okay, so.
Let me try.
Okay, let's continue with the second part of this workshop. And please welcome our second speaker, Eduardo Aponte. Earlier this year, he started a research position in the pharma industry, and he now works on cognitive and clinical biomarkers at the Roche Innovation Center in Basel. Thanks, Eduardo, for being here.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, everybody, for being here. So first, let me tell you a bit about myself and about my path. So I have a sort of a different path of most people. I started with a bachelor degree in philosophy in the National University of Colombia. Then I also did a master's in cognitive science. I worked as a data analyst in a biotech in United States right after my master's degree. And then I went in to do a PhD in computational psychiatry in Switzerland. I stayed there as a postdoctoral fellow, and now I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Roche. Working in the biomarker and translational technology group as part of the clinical computational neuroscience team, which is directed by Chris Chatham, and it's a very new group. So let me give you a short summary of what I will be talking to today about. So I'm going to give you a short tour in how drug development works in industry and what are the current trends. And I think that's important because it is sometimes hard to see what actually the pharmaceutical industry is doing from outside. Before joining Roche, it was really hard for me to understand the roles and what is the actual process behind developing a drug. And I cannot say right now that I'm an expert, but now at least I have an idea of what are the most important parts of it and how biomarker discovery is important there. So I want also to tell you something about when and why drug development fails and in diseases of the central nervous system, and what are biomarkers and how can they help in drug development. And I think I thought this will be very relevant for you guys as you have been developing all these skills in neuroimaging, and maybe the question now is, okay, how can I apply these skills? What is actually the use of that in the pharmaceutical industry? So I'm gonna tell you something about it, and I'm gonna give you an example in depression. So first, let me give you a very, very short tour in how drug development works. And developing a drug is a very expensive and very time-consuming process. So nowadays, it takes from between 12 and 15 years to develop a new molecule. And it can cost up to $1 billion or more right now on average. And basically, the drug development is divided into phases or into main sections. The first one is discovery. And this is about first and most importantly, start target identification. And target, you can think about it as a biological mechanism that can be affected to produce a therapeutical effect. So you can think about different receptors, dopamine receptor or the dopamine transporter. So this is the first part of drug development. Then as a next step is to try to find molecules that interact with that target. And that's done through high throughput mechanisms, through computational simulations, etc. And there comes like a cascade of optimizations. So trying to find a molecule that is safe, that is most likely to have an effect on the area of interest. And in this initial phase, after this initial phase, and after there's good evidence of safety, the molecule is moved to the first clinical trial, the first time that the molecule is given to humans, and this is called the phase 1. And the main interest in the phase 1 is to test for safety. So that is how much of the medication can be given safely to individual subjects. And usually this part of the clinical trial recruits something like 20 to 100 people, usually healthy volunteers. And now there's a cascade of decision points, and that's what differentiates these phases, where basically a team of scientists sit down, makes a readout of all the available data, and take a decision whether to continue the development of a drug. And as the drug development process goes on, it becomes more and more expensive as more people are involved. So in this phase 2 part of the study, it's about efficacy and partially about safety. And the idea is to try to test for the first time if the mechanism, if the new molecule has actually an effect on a therapeutical effect as predicted. So it's the first time that it's really about, is it efficacious or not? And this part of the study usually recruits something like 100 to 500 people. And usually it's called a proof of concept. And if the team decides that there's good evidence, there's going to be an effect, a therapeutical effect, it goes into phase 3. And this is about, again, testing efficacy, but through clinical endpoints. Clinical endpoints are basically established tests that have an effect on the well-being of patients. So in phase 2, you don't necessarily need a completely established piece of evidence to take a decision. It can be a new method, a new way to, a new digital biomarker, or some kind of information or some kind of evidence that it might have actually an effect. Whereas in phase 3 is really about very, very well established clinical measures. And this part of the studies recruits as many as 5,000 people. It can happen in as many as 20 countries, and takes roughly between 2 and 5 years usually, depending on the particular condition. And after this period, it goes to basically the company prepares all the evidence that has been accumulated over phase 1, 2, and 3 to ask for approval from an agency, usually the FDA in America. This process takes something like 2 years again, and there comes phase 4 if the medication is approved. And the idea here is that even when the medication has been approved, you would like to test for safety. For example, what happens when you give chronically the same medication to a person for 20 years. So that's a very short summary of how drug development works. But there's something very interesting to be said about the productivity in the pharmaceutical industry, and it's called the Eroom's law, and it's the opposite of Moore's law. So Moore's law said that every 2 years the number of the number of transistors in a chip will decrease by a factor of 2, so it will grow exponentially, and that was true for roughly 40 years. But in the pharmaceutical industry, exactly the same, the opposite pattern is happening. So basically, what you see here is the number of drugs that have been approved for $1 billion investment, starting in 1950 to 2010. And this is a logarithmic scale. So basically, what you are seeing is by duplicating the amount of investment, the industry is still getting the same amount of drugs. And to the point that right now, around 1 in 10 novel molecular entities that enter phase 1 actually receive regulatory approval. So the industry is going through this crisis of how to manage investment given the poor results in terms of new therapies brought to the market. And that's particularly bad in neuroscience. So this is a very interesting figure where it shows what percentage of molecules that enter different phase actually reach launch, so are actually accepted by the regulator. And you can see that for neuroscience, the number of only 3% of the new molecules that enter phase 1 will actually turn into a therapy. And that's the worst case, close to cardiovascular diseases. And as you can see, this image prevails in phase 2 and phase 3. So there's really a negative track record in neuroscience in developing new therapies. And that implies that large pharma companies have been reducing or phasing out their investment in CNS, in the central nervous system diseases, due to the high failure rate. So what you can see is that only a handful or only some of the largest companies are actually still investing in neuroscience. In the last few years, companies like Pfizer, Merck, GlaxoSmithKline completely closed their neuroscience departments. And the reason, again, is because of the high failure rate. So I want to say here that Roche is one of the exceptions. So it has a very strong neuroscience pipeline. Roche is investing in diseases like Alzheimer's disease, autism. Probably is the company with the largest program in autism, but also Parkinson's and other different conditions. So obviously the question is therefore, why do clinical trials in the CNS fail at a high rate? There have been a number of opinion papers from different stakeholders that have suggested some of the reasons for this, and I just would like to tell you something about it. So one of the reasons is poor understanding of the neurobiology of some of these diseases. For example, in autism and schizophrenia, we still don't know what is the pathophysiology that actually triggers the symptoms, and thus identifying a biological target that can be affected by a drug is extremely hard. So that's one of the main reasons. There's also uncertainty about preclinical models of disease. So basically, in the early development of a drug in the discovery phases, drugs are tested in animal models. But the question has been for the last 10 years, do these animal models predict how the drug is going to behave in humans? And basically, the agreement of many companies is that basically mice don't have schizophrenia or depression. So these are so because of that, trying to test any drug, any antipsychotic in a rat is actually a bad idea. So it's been a very large problem for the industry. But something that might be more interesting for you is something like patient heterogeneity. So we know now that every single person with autism is very different from the next. And that makes it really hard to develop a drug for autism. Also because you will need a very, very large number of participants to see an effect, a therapeutical effect. So that's one of the points where the industry is struggling right now. But there are other things like subjective and insensitive rating scales or clinical endpoints. So in this case, for example, when developing a clinical trial for autism or for schizophrenia, there are only not very good or not always very consistent clinical scales that sometimes fail to replicate over several measurements. So that's definitely also one of the big problems. And there are, of course, things as enrolling patients at the early stage of their disease progression. That's very important for Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, as it is clear that maybe only medication at the beginning of the disease is helpful for participants. Of course, that triggers that clinical trials can be extremely extremely long. In the case of Alzheimer's, it could be up to 5 years, and that can be extremely expensive and logistically very difficult to do. And of course, one of the problems here is lack of biomarkers, and that's where I'm going to talk a bit longer about. Biomarkers play a role in three things. First, in exposure to the target site, and this is extremely important in neuroscience because of the blood-brain barrier. Even if you give medication or a new molecule to a participant, it is not always clear that it reaches the brain. And that lack of certainty has affected several clinical trials. So it is not obvious that a drug actually reaches the brain. And if it reaches the brain, it is also not obvious that it reaches the target, or particularly if it affects the receptor that you are targeting. So there's also a question about target occupancy. And of course, there are questions about functional modulation, so the therapeutic effect that it can have. And the idea is that lacking good biomarkers to test this has been a large issue for the industry. So exactly what are biomarkers and why can they help? And the usual definition is that biomarkers are defined as characteristics that are objectively measured and evaluated as indicators of normal biological process, pathogenic processes, or pharmacological responses to an intervention. So you can think about, for example, biomarkers of target exposure and engagement as, for example, PET. So that's usually the method a tracer is developed, and it can be used to test if there's receptor occupancy in the brain. This is extremely expensive, but is a very important area for the pharmaceutical industry. There are, of course, so-called fluid biomarkers. So basically, you look at the presence of a certain molecule in the cerebrospinal fluid. There are functional modulation biomarkers. So in the industry, a lot of defects in phase 2 are tested with EEG, with fMRI, actually with behavioral test, and the new trend is digital biomarkers. That's basically apps that are developed just to test changes in cognition or in behavior, and that's a very promising part of the new technologies. And of course, there are questions about patient selection in terms of genetics, fMRI, and EEG. So how effective are biomarkers? Excuse me. So biomarkers make the difference in successful clinical trials. This is a super interesting study from 2014, where AstraZeneca asked the question, what are the characteristics of clinical trials that in phase 2 that are successful? And there were two things that predicted or that were correlated with success in these projects. The first one was that there were good biomarkers available at the start of this phase. So there was so in the people developing these molecules, there was a good confidence that there was a method to measure, for example, target occupancy. As you can see, something like 82% of the projects that had this were successful at this stage. So this is blue here. And the ones that did not have this confidence, they tend to be far less successful. Even equally useful was to have confidence in patient selection in phase 2. So if you have a good method to select which participants come into your trial, that actually was really, really predictive of the success of a clinical trial. Whereas projects that lack that tend to not be successful. So biomarkers do make a difference in successful clinical trials. And I would like to end up with an example. This this is not from my work or related to work at Roche, but I think it's the type of projects that might make a difference for the industry. So it's about patient stratification in depression, and this is a study from last year, published last year, and the basic idea was to try to see what predicts the efficacy of an antidepressant, sertraline, versus placebo in medication-free patients. And basically, what they first observed, just looking at the difference of patients that receive placebo in red and patients that receive antidepressant, is that indeed the antidepressant had an effect in reducing depression as measured by a clinical scale. And also in remittance from therapy. So again, placebo is in red and sertraline is in blue. But the effect was relatively small. And the question is there some way to actually select the participants that are going to be in the study to increase the probability of remittance, of remission? And for this, this group used an emotional task, basically looking at conflict situation. Or adaptation to conflict. And the hypothesis is that those participants that are very good at adapting in conflict situations, in emotional conflict situations, were most likely to show a therapeutic effect with this antidepressant. And indeed, they found that different levels of activation in dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the LPFC actually had predictive effect on how good this antidepressant will act on participants. So just as concluding remarks, I think that biomarkers are supposed to play an essential role in future clinical trials, and especially fMRI and PET will play a pivotal role in this direction. And from my personal experience, I've seen that there is a really strong collaboration between the pharmaceutical industry and academia. So people at industry, they read everyday papers. They're really interested in what are the new trends in academia and what are the new ideas that are coming out. So sometimes there's this idea that industry sits on an ivory tower and doesn't try to hear what academics are doing. That's, in my experience, not true. There's a real big interest in the things that you guys are coming with, and there's a increasing interest in finding new biomarkers that might help in developing new drugs. And that's the last slide.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. So again, as of Anna, if anyone has questions, just type it in the chat or unmute your microphone and ask him directly. Oh, there are the first questions already.
What are the most important skills that graduate students from neuroimaging bring to academia? Expertise for specific modalities or the general skill set? I think it depends. As Anna said, it really depends on the role. In large corporations, there's a space for very specialized people. So some people come, or for example, in my case, I was really hard because of my computational abilities or skills, and as that's actually what I'm doing right now at Roche. So I think that in smaller companies, having very general skills is very useful. In large companies, being very, very specialized might be actually helpful, although it might be hard to find the role that you are looking for. So there's a trade-off there. As there are several computational neuroscience groups in academia looking for clinical biomarker, how is it different working in this field in pharma? I think that the big difference is the importance of confirming your results. I think in academia, it's okay to developing a new idea, doing it for half a year, publish a paper, and then move on, regardless of how successful it replicates, etc. In pharma, because these pieces of information are so important and are so costly if they are not properly validated. There's a real interest in confirming your results. So it's not about coming up every year, every 6 months with a new idea, but if you come with an idea, validate it and make sure that it really has an impact in several programs. What is the pharma view of dimensional psychiatry? For example, viewing mental disorders as dysfunctions of basic neurocognitive mechanism rather than relying on conventional disease categories according to the DSM-5. Are there existing collaborations with academia in this direction for identifying biomarkers? So maybe to the second question, there's many collaborations. So for example, right now, most of my work is in autism, and Roche is supporting the largest experiment in Europe in this regard. So definitely in collaboration with several academic partners. So there's definitely a lot of consortium where companies like Roche, but not only Roche, participate, and they have a great interest in support them. And regarding dimensional psychiatry, yeah, so I think this, for many reasons, the pharma industry has realized that these diagnostic categories are not helpful, and it has been very difficult to develop new drugs because of that. So there's a large interest in, for example, using genetic information to actually inform the selection of participants in a clinical trial. So I definitely think that most people in the pharma industry will agree that we need a new way to think about psychiatric diseases and not in not in completely independent categories. Is it common to get into pharma without formal life science education? I think, yeah, I think it's, I think most people in pharma, at least in more research roles, they have a PhD and a postdoc in the field. I'm a very special case, but I definitely, after my bachelor degree, I moved in the direction of what you call hard sciences, but without a strong background in, for example, biology or chemistry or cognitive neuroscience, then it's really hard. How is your day-to-day life at Roche from morning to evening? What do you do? That's a really good question. So I'm in a very special role because as a postdoc, I'm working mostly on research. So that means that I have less kind of office type of work. So I really dedicate most of my time to scientific projects. So a lot of it is, as you experience in academia, is working with data, making a lot of presentations for different stakeholders. So I think that's very different from academia and industry in my experience, that in industry, the projects are much larger and you are supposed to have a much bigger impact. So it means that you have to communicate with many different stakeholders. So there's a lot of stakeholder management involved. That means meetings and being present and explaining what you are doing. But for the moment, it's not as different as my life as a postdoc in academia. Was it easier to transition back to industry since you had worked in industry after your master's? Yeah, definitely. I think that if you have some industry experience after a master's degree, that probably helps you to start in academia. That demonstrates that you have a good time management skills. So I think that opens a door, that doesn't close the door. Which other companies or pharma industries do you know that work with clinical neuroimaging? I would say that all companies in neuroscience work with PET and fMRI. There's a big interest in those technologies. PET is universal. Most of the times nowadays, that's outsourced. So there will be academic partners that run PET experiments for pharmaceutical companies. Roche is a bit different. So working for pharma, to work for pharma, you don't necessarily need to work in a pharma company. You can be an academic lab that runs studies for large companies. if I didn't work with data and spending my time behind computer, what other roles I could apply for. So if you work mostly with, for example, patients, or so there are different roles there. If you have worked a lot with participants, there are more like what is called translational medicine. So it's really helping with organizing clinical trials. And there's, of course, more the discovery phase where you were working with animals. So that's also part of the pipeline. Do you feel restricted in the research questions you can ask concerning the cliché that pharma only researches what will give the highest profit? Yeah, that's true, but I think that in academia, that's also a bit true. So you have to try to find which is your niche and how can you maximize the impact that you have. And in academia, in industry is the same. So you have some questions, but you have to adapt them to the realities of the programs that a company is developing. So you try to find balance between what you are interested in doing and what the company is actually doing. Lena, I skipped Lena's question. If you could ask it again, that would be helpful. Lena, could you ask your question again? What is a skill that?
Sorry, I can't find it. I was just asking regarding life, so personal and work balance, about differences between academia and pharma.
I think it depends on the company and it depends on your boss. Chris, my boss, basically told me he doesn't expect me to work on the weekend, and he does accommodate. He tries to actually minimize the hours that I work. So definitely in a company like Roche, there's an interest that there's a balance between private life and work life. But as you know, as you can imagine, there are people that are extremely passionate about science. So even if they have the opportunity to spend more time at home, they will still work. So it depends. But at least from my experience at Roche, there's the policy of allowing the employees to have a good balance.
Great, thanks.
What is a skill that academics tend not to learn, which is important to learn for industry? Maybe stakeholder management, maybe politics if you want. So it's very important to understand that there are other people that are also involved in your projects, people that generate the data, people that have interest in your results. So being able to communicate with all these stakeholders and being able to have good relationships with them is extremely, extremely valuable. And sometimes in academia, it's so centered in a particular person, usually in your in the professor in charge of the lab, that you forget that there are other people that are also important and that nobody's the center of the world. So that's something that I've learned and has been very helpful for me. I'm a research assistant working on neuroimaging techniques on Alzheimer's data. I am a master's degree on medical imaging and experience processing different types of modalities. Are there any roles for people like me from the engineering background? I think they are. So there are people in charge of data management, and for that, usually they come with both a degree in computer science and imaging, so that it can be helpful. I think those types of roles are more on demand. So if a program requires that, then they will hire somebody for the next 2 years or 3 years. So yeah, there are definitely opportunities, but it's probably not gonna end in a full-time employment.
I think we keep the time in mind. It's already 8:06. So maybe if you have any further questions, you can just email Eduardo, and can call it a day or a night or a morning, wherever you are. Maybe Eduardo, you could put your email address here or your Twitter handle so people can reach out to you. And thank you again, Eduardo, and also Anna, for all your helpful answers to all of our questions and your great talks. I think all of us agree they were super helpful and interesting.
Okay, thank you, everybody.